Look how much African American communities have suffered. You're living in poverty. Your schools are no good. You have no jobs.
You got a new prison industrial complex. Poor folk get caught. Drugs on the corner. But not one executive of a Wall Street bank goes to jail.
We know about the pipeline to prison. How do we stop this thing and turn it around?
You need more police. We need law and order.
The people in our prisons have made some mistakes, and sometimes big mistakes. They are also Americans.
I'm a Detroiter from the East Side. Cass Tech, class of 95. I like the line, you can't move forward unless you know where we've been. Another native Detroiter and Cass Tech graduate, Heather Ann Thompson, knows where we've been too. She's a historian and can tell us how this pathway to prison got started. Mass incarceration. You hear a lot about it. Can you give us some perspective on what mass incarceration really is and why it should matter?
Well, at bottom, mass incarceration was a policy choice. It is something that this country embarked upon in 1965, deciding to handle all social ills, poverty, addiction, mental illness, and really low-level crimes, rather than through the social welfare system, through the criminal justice system. And what this meant was beginning a war on crime that was historically unprecedented. We'd never put those kinds of resources to this before. This is under the presidency of Lyndon Johnson. Johnson is responding to urban protests in cities like Philadelphia and communities like Harlem, by the way, all of which were rebelling against police brutality.
The policies provided more funding for police, ultimately putting more people behind bars. Mark Fancher of the ACLU's Racial Justice Project says, by the late 1960s, those policies and politics went hand in hand.
You also had something else going on, and that was the use of coded language by politicians. Richard Nixon campaigned on a slogan of law and order.
It's time for some honest talk about the problem of order in the United States. Let us always respect, as I do, our courts and those who serve on them, but let us also recognize that some of our courts, in their decisions, have gone too far in weakening the peace forces as against the criminal forces in this country.
And he exploited the reactions of the black community to oppression and to police violence to speak to largely white voters and to say that he was the candidate who was going to bring people back into line. He was going to calm down these insurrections. He never said that explicitly, but everybody knew what that meant when he talked about law and order.
And this is the house I grew up in. Look at it. It's destroyed. I actually grew up during the war on drugs at 6 Mile and Gratiot. My neighborhood literally changed overnight. Crack cocaine caught us off guard. It brought immediate violence, addiction, and misery.
The undeniable fact is that those who became addicted to crack were sick people. They were people who were in need of treatment and rehabilitation. This country chose to treat them as criminals.
So one of the greatest ironies about the drug war, just like with Prohibition in the 20s, when you make something illegal and people have no other resources to lean upon to feed their families, you have created a very, very dangerous economy.
Studies have demonstrated consistently that the rate of drug use among whites and people of color is essentially the same. But if you look, you see a huge disproportion with respect to people of color. And so it has been a very racially targeted campaign. The worst instances of it was the 100-to-1 disparity in sentencing for crack cocaine versus powder cocaine.
And Detroit was really ground zero, both for the drug war first and then the fallout from the drug war afterwards.
Ground zero. Prohibition lasted only 16 years. The war on drugs doesn't seem like it'll ever stop. As a result of running away from a broken home, Detroiter Shaka Senghor saw it firsthand.
I began to hang out with other broken boys that grew up in the neighborhood, and we kind of bonded around our brokenness.
Like many others, at the age of 15, Shaka took the only opportunity that he could see at the time, selling drugs. At 19, he killed a man.
In July 1991, on the night that I fired those fatal shots. What was going through my head in that moment was fear and survival. And when I went into prison, I walked in with all of the anger, the fears, the anxieties that I had accumulated while living my life on the streets. I blamed everybody except for myself, and ultimately, I found myself getting in a lot of trouble my first 5 years. I was one of the youngest persons sent to maximum security. At the age of 19, I turned 20 in maximum security prison.
Shaka went to prison during the mass incarceration boom. After that, President Bill Clinton's crime bill ushered in a new era of mandatory minimums, ultimately hurting more African American families while helping fill penitentiaries.
It wasn't really about the fact that laws were being broken. It was about where the policing was where laws were being broken. So, for example, you had more white folks selling drugs and using drugs than black folks, but all the police were dispersed into mostly black and brown neighborhoods.
In the suburbs, you may have a group of affluent white youth who are relaxing in the large home, using some of the most exotic drugs imaginable. But you're not going to find police crashing down doors to try and get to these kids. You're not going to find police in suburban shopping malls stopping and frisking and patting down affluent white youth, even though they may be doing the exact same thing or worse than their counterparts in low-income communities of color.
So ultimately what this means is that the criminal justice system is way disproportionately filled with black and brown youth and eventually older people as they age through the system. And that sends a message to America, right? It just underscores this myth that somehow there's a connection between criminality and blackness.
I don't know that from day to day, prosecutors or even police or judges wake up with the idea that we're going to, lock up a lot of black people. I don't think that happens, but I do think that it has been so much a part of the country's historical agenda that now it has become essentially institutionalized.
There were people I knew who weren't bound to be criminals. They weren't violent offenders at all. But after serving time with the Department of Corrections, they emerged more hardened and more likely to fit the stereotypes some might feel unsafe being around. Shaka Senghor addresses that same mindset in his best-selling book, Righting My Wrongs, where the term corrections is a misnomer.
I was in solitary confinement a total of 7 years out of the 19 years that I served in prison. At one point, I was in solitary confinement for 4.5 years straight. And it is the most horrific and barbaric environment that I believe exists in American society. It's a secret society, clandestine, if you will, and it's one of the greatest tragedies because the level of mental illness inside solitary confinement is astronomical.
Somehow Shaka came out with his mind intact, as well as a mission to tell his story as part of the movement for prison reform. While all this gives Heather Ann Thompson hope, she can't help but wonder if we might soon be heading in the wrong direction.
Now, I think it's really unclear where we're going to go. We have a new president who has routinely said that what we need is, to use his words, law and order. And it is deeply distressing to hear that. As a historian and as a Detroiter, those words were the words that touched off 40 years of devastating policies. We do not have a crime crisis right now. We have a crisis of poverty, we have a crisis of incarceration, and we have a crisis of violence in the most heavily incarcerated communities. The idea that we would need more of that we need more policing, that we need more prisons, just flies in the face of what every expert knows, what every mother with children in prison knows, what every child with a parent in prison knows. And so I worry for our next decade.